All right. Welcome, everybody. It's March 29th, 2024, episode number 16 of Into the Fire. Welcome. We appreciate everybody that's here. And hopefully, I already know that we're going to have a great show tonight. I want to apologize for last week. There was a little bit of extra noise going on. Apparently 7 o'clock in my house, about 7:30 p.m. happens to be like the most important time that everybody wants to sit around and watch me. And they carry on conversations, but we're going to try to avoid that tonight. Ronnie, welcome.
Thank you. Welcome to you.
I'm excited to spend this evening with you. I know it comes to a great surprise to everybody that people think that, me and you just hang out all the time and just chop it up on a daily, but no, that's not the way it goes.
We don't.
It's not that I don't like you. It's just that we're both very, very busy people. I want to congratulate the two winners from the drawing that we gave away, or that random giveaway that we gave away last week. And that was Jennifer Dakar and Tony Cerniglia. I think that's how you pronounce it. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong, but anyway, congratulations to the both of you for winning that. Both of them got an incredibly expensive light bulb that is life-saving. So, and also thank you to, I'm sorry, that's grandbaby. That is not going to happen tonight, I promise. But anyway, so thank you. This week I was in San Antonio. I was speaking at the Homicide Investigators of Texas conference that is held in the last part of March each and every year. And that was tremendous, actually. I loved it. Of the people
what did you talk about?
Well, I talked about interpreting crime scenes, and I also talked about a no body case that I had, which is actually perfectly appropriate for tonight because the guru, there I am right there, the guru of no body cases, as far as I'm concerned, he's probably one of the authorities with respect to that type of stuff, is going to be here tonight talking about his experience and stuff like that. And so I talked about that. And one of the things that they did for me, which was, I'll mention this real quick, is one of the guests that was there that was speaking was Steve Spignola, which is somebody that's really interesting. There he is right there. Many of you may have seen him on the Oxygen channel. And if you don't know him from that, you've actually seen him because he was one of the lead detectives in reference to the Jeffrey Dahmer case. And it was fascinating. He covered that, and he also covered another case that he was assisting on, which was the Kyle Rittenhouse situation that happened up in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And just a fascinating guy. He was just a lot of fun to sit and visit with. And I talked to him briefly about Cold Justice. And it was a good thing that Kelly Sigler, who is actually the host of Cold Justice, wasn't there, because she'd probably need a protective order on me at that event. I'm pretty sure. Nevertheless, he took off afterwards, and he took off. But I also want to give a shout out to somebody that you know as well, Ronnie, and it's Paul Keith. Throw up that picture at the Alamo. There he is right there. That's Paul Keith. He is kind of the arranger and the organizer of that event, and that's a new position for him. And so he had reached out and asked me if I was willing to speak. And of course I said yes. And just to tell you the classiness of this organization, they actually gave me a lifetime membership to their organization. And nice. I've spoken and this next speaker, he spoke everywhere too, I'm sure, but I've spoken at a motherload of places, and I've never had that happen. And I was really, really honored and moved by that. So I don't know. That's that. Tell me something else, and then we'll get ready. Anything else?
I think we quiet week at work, but I'd just like to say my appreciation to Paul as well. I had a case, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago now at least, and our suspects took off from Tulsa and ended up down there in his neck of woods, and we got hold of him, and he had a ton of people mobilized real quickly, helped us out throughout the night, and we got the 2 people in custody, and one of them has already pled guilty and is in prison. The other one, I actually have a trial on it starting a week from Monday, so I can't appreciate him any more than I already have. He was just great. So anyway, let's get on with Tad.
Yeah. And listen, if you're listening in like Abe from an agency near Little Elm, and that's where Paul works. He works at Little Elm PD, but there's a lot of other people that he introduced me to. I hung out with the guys from Beaumont, Texas. I want to thank them for keeping me supplied in the beer department, and to the Wise County Sheriff's Office. Those guys were awesome. Everybody there was just great. I mean, I don't know that I've met just hung out with a lot of, if you're just as cool as these guys were, if you're a law enforcement officer in the state of Texas, you don't have to necessarily be within a homicide unit. You can just join this organization, and it's not expensive. It's a great group of people, and they meet every year, and it's fantastic. So I highly suggest that. And then finally, before we get rolling here, I want to mention one last thing, and then we'll get going to Tad. But my nephew ended up starting a coffee shop, and I wanted to at least give him a shout out. It's called Fulfilled. And the reason why I mention it is, number one, I want him to be incredibly successful. And you know what I feel about this? He didn't tell me this, and he didn't even know I was going to put him on here, but I just feel that we're going to have a giveaway with that company at some point in time, because he loves his uncle and he knows that I'm going to need a huge bag of coffee to give away in the future. And maybe even he'll want to sponsor us at some point in time down the line. You just never know if it takes off. So if you're in Owasso, Oklahoma, and if you get a chance, his name is Mackenzie. Him and his wife started that business. It's supposed to be awesome. So check it out. And I would appreciate it, and he would appreciate it big time. Let's get to the bio of this next guest, who is somebody that we've been trying to get on here for the last few weeks, and he's an incredibly busy person. But Thomas, he goes by Tad DiBiase, received a BA in politics from Wake Forest University in 1987 and a Juris Doctorate degree from Brooklyn Law School in 1991. From 1995 to 2007, he was an assistant U.S. attorney with the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia and spent most of his career trying homicide cases. In 2006, he tried United States versus Harold Austin, only DC's second no-body trial ever. He is the nation's leading expert on no-body homicide cases and has a website that tracks and discusses these cases at www.nobodycases.com, which we will put up shortly. And he tweets at, if you're a tweeter or a Twitter, well, it's not even tweet. It's not even Twitter anymore. It's X. But if you get on X, it's at the Nobody Guy. We'll make sure that we publish that. He consults with police and prosecutors throughout the country on no-body homicide cases, and has formally consulted on more than 40 no-body homicide or murder cases. He has appeared on television numerous times and has been quoted widely in newspapers throughout the country. His book, No Body Homicide Cases, A Practical Guide to Investigating, Prosecuting, and Winning When the Victim is Missing, remains the only how-to book on the topic, and the second edition came out in November of 2023, and he resides in Washington, D.C. Welcome to Tad DiBiase.
Great.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Ronnie, for having me on.
Thanks for being here.
Listen, I think I first met you. I met you on the phone. Actually, I've never met you in person, but I called you several years ago, and it was in reference to a no body case here in Tulsa. And you were incredibly gracious to take my call and give me some ideas and so forth. And I know that my case was, you mentioned it in your new book that just came out.
Yep.
And so tell us a little bit about how you got started in this section of homicide, which is pretty unique.
Absolutely. And, Jason, when I was preparing for this interview, I knew I had met you before, and I went back and looked, and I didn't realize just how many years ago it was that we had talked about your case. So I was a prosecutor, as you mentioned, in the DC U.S. Attorney's Office, which is a really unique U.S. Attorney's Office because DC doesn't have a district attorney. So basically, a lot of what most district attorneys' offices would do is handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office. So they do everything from shoplifting to murder, as well as what we think of our traditional federal prosecutor crimes, RICO, narcotics cases, white collar cases. Most of my 12 years in the office were spent in the homicide section because that's what I was interested in. And when I was there, I got given to me by a colleague who was going to a different section. He gave me what was at the time a missing persons case. And I thought, oh, this is great, because he told me, I think it's a homicide. And I kind of went through it and immediately realized, hey, this is a homicide case. This isn't a missing persons case. And so I decided, let me research other no-body murders in the District of Columbia because, as I think you both know, particularly when I was in the office, the DC had a very high murder rate. It's sort of full employment for DC homicide detectives and DC homicide prosecutors in DC because we have so many murders. But interestingly, I could only find one no-body murder case that had ever gone to trial in DC, and it happened back in the mid 1980s. So I decided, let me look in other jurisdictions to see, like, what do you need to prove? How do you do this type of case? And in doing so, I got a memo from a colleague of mine who had investigated a case in DC, but it had never taken it to trial. And he probably gave me 50 or 60 cases. And so I started building up that list for my trial. And then ultimately, I tried my case in January of 2006, got a successful result, and then decided, hey, I'm going to try and track these cases. And so I started collecting them, posting them on the internet, and saying, okay, I'm going to sort of methodically go through these cases because no one had ever done that, and say what separates a no-body murder case from a regular murder case, because there really are some differences. The biggest one being when you don't have the body, you don't have the best piece of evidence in a case. So that's sort of what started me. And then it just kind of snowballed, particularly when I left the office. At the time, I kid that my no body guy nickname was only because I didn't want to give my real name when I was at the Department of Justice, because I didn't want to jump through all the hoops to get permission to do what I was doing. And so I used a nickname. But then when I left the office in 2007, I could come out of the closet, so to speak, and say, okay, this is who I am. And so I started posting lists of cases and description of cases. And very soon after that, I started getting calls from the press when there were no body murder cases. And to me, more importantly, started getting calls from police, detectives such as yourself and Ronnie, and prosecutors saying, how do you make these types of cases? And that's when I started consulting on cases, and then ultimately teaching a class that I do for law enforcement about how to bring these cases forward and how to successfully prosecute these cases.
What's some of the something specific you have to do, since you don't have a body, to actually prove that a murder has happened? Can you just kind of touch on that a little bit?
Sure. That's a really good question, because in a normal homicide case, you don't have to spend any time proving the victim is dead, right? You call a medical examiner who comes forward and says, yeah, that guy's dead. I examined him, I cut him open, and here's the cause of death, here's the manner of death. In a no-body murder case, you don't have any of that. You don't have a cause of death. You probably don't have a manner of death. You don't have a time of death, and you don't have a place of death. So that makes them uniquely difficult, because you have to spend so much time proving the person is dead. And that's the first step. And then the second step is proving the guy sitting over there in the defendant's chair is the one who actually did it. And that makes it incredibly challenging. And when I talk to prosecutors, I tell them, the case that you're going to put on is going to be the longest trial you've ever had, because you're going to spend a lot of time putting on circumstantial evidence and proving that the person is dead. That's the hardest part of the trial. And hopefully it'll be easier once you've proven they're dead, connecting it to the defendant. But that's unique, because typically in a murder case, you don't have to spend any time proving the person is dead.
Right. Is there anything unique that legally that says X, Y, and Z has happened or hasn't happened, so we can say this guy is deceased?
So it used to be the case, there were certain jurisdictions that actually said if you didn't have a body, you couldn't prove the murder case, New York and Texas being the two primary examples. Thankfully, all of that is done. And I actually found in my research all 50 states, as well as DC, which is not a state, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, all these other places, all have had no body murder cases. But there used to be excuse me, a legal requirement that you had to have a body. So that's gone. But what ends up happening in most no body murder cases is you're proving a whole bunch of circumstantial evidence, because it's fairly rare to have a no body murder case where a witness comes forward and says, oh yeah, I was there, I saw it, I helped chop up the body and get rid of it. It happens, but it's pretty rare. So you spend a lot of time convincing the jury, hey, circumstantial evidence is the same as direct, which is a legal instruction in most jurisdictions. There's no difference between those two types of evidence. But as a lay person, you have to be convinced of that, because in most lay people's mind, they say, you only got circumstantial evidence. That's not any evidence against me. And you have to tell your jury, no, they're considered the same, and here's why they're considered the same.
Mm-hmm. How many cases have they actually, that you know of? Because I'm sure that there are some that you haven't learned about all of them. But how many have there been, and what has been the success rate in the courts?
Sure, that's also a really good question, Jason. I have found 599 cases that have gone to trial in the United States since the early 1800s. So I'm very excited to get the 600th case. So if any of your listeners know of a case that's not on my list, let me know. And interestingly, the conviction rate in those cases is about 87%, which is a very high conviction rate. Now, when you think of crimes overall that go to trial, the homicide conviction rate is actually the highest rate for convictions, but it only runs about 71% for what I call kind of run-of-the-mill murder cases. The homicide or the conviction rate in no-body murder cases is significantly higher, 16, 17%, which seems counterintuitive, because here I just said, hey, these cases are hard. But the difference is a lot of no-body murder cases, about 54%, are what we'd call domestic. Husband kills wife, boyfriend kills girlfriend, boyfriend kills ex-girlfriend, parent kills child. So when you have that type of victim, right away the police say, okay, I got a dead wife who is, a suburban housewife, work-a-day person, has children, has suddenly gone missing. Who are our suspects? Well, okay, probably the husband is the suspect. So in a lot of these no-body murder cases, the suspect becomes pretty obvious because of the relationship. And obviously in a child missing person's case, the suspect is also very obvious. Now, that's not to say there aren't cases where wives and girlfriends are killed by strangers and children are killed by strangers. But as you all both know, those are the exceptions. That is not the rule. So a lot of no-body murder cases start off with kind of an obvious suspect. And the challenge for the detectives becomes, how am I going to prove that it's this person and that it's not someone else? Because that's an additional challenge in a no-body murder case. Your suspect pool is so much larger, because I don't know when they died, I don't know how they died, I don't know where they died. And that makes for a much larger suspect pool than in your typical homicide case.
I would think now, in today's world, with there being so much electronic type of evidence that gets dealt with, that's going to be something that would be huge, that the detectives and the prosecutors would be interested in. If this person has, posted on social media every hour for every day for years and years, and all of a sudden they drop off, they quit going to work. Is there any other things that just really jump out to you that get looked at?
Yeah, so that's a good point. Of the, let's say 600 cases for a round number, of the 600 cases I've found, more than half of them have occurred since the year 2000. So we're talking the last, 24, 25 years. More than half have gone to trial since that time. And the two biggest reasons why are, number one, what you just mentioned, Ronnie, electronic trail we all leave behind. Here we are talking on a computer, and if someone came onto my computer tomorrow, they'd see that I was on a podcast and I was on the computer from this time to this time, and they'd see my, cell phone. Who was I talking to? Who was I texting with? Was I posting on Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook? None of that existed 25 years ago, let alone 50 years ago. The second big difference, I think, is related to DNA. And the advances in DNA have made it much easier for very small amounts of DNA to look at those and determine who they came from. And even in the case of unknown DNA, to determine what my suspect might look like. And in the terms of genealogy, genealogical DNA to go out there and say, I have unknown DNA. Let me try and figure out who this DNA may have come from. Those are all incredible advances that didn't exist, in the genealogical DNA. It didn't list 10 years ago. And in these, cell tower records and things like that, they didn't exist 50 years ago. That has made a tremendous difference in the solving and the ability of detectives to get information in these cases that just wasn't possible previously.
And Jason, it seems like I helped you on on your no body. It seems like we did a couple interviews together, but what was it specifically that you wanted to reach out to him for, and how did he kind of help you on that?
Well, just to kind of give you a little bit of an idea what that all entailed, Tad, is that back when I'd contacted, and I probably told you the story years ago, but when I had contacted you, I was thrilled that you actually had a book that covered this, because I just got on Google just to see what information existed in reference to no body cases, and that's when your book came up. And from there, I actually was able to get a copy, and I started, and it's really an interesting read. And I just kind of went through there to see what you had suggested. The problems that I had faced in the case and how it went is that a young lady by the name of Latricia Phipps had not returned home, but yet she had told her family that she'd been picked up by her ex-boyfriend, and they were going to go pick up the kids and then she would be home directly thereafter. Of course, he didn't mention that. He said no, that he took her straight home, but yet nobody ended up seeing her get dropped off on the street. And then the family didn't really think anything of it until the next morning when the babysitter had called them and said, "Hey, are you guys ever going to come and pick these kids up?" And so therefore he's already got like there's a 16 or an 18 hour
head start.
Absolutely. And so what happened then is the family panicked, and then they ended up going out to his residence, which was east of Tulsa, out in kind of a rural area. And when they got there, it looked like somebody had taken off in a hurry, and the front door was still open. And then the police officers actually ended up meeting up with the ex-boyfriend a couple of days later. And, when you look at it in retrospect now, you can see that he had scratches all over his forehead. And I really wish, kind of one of the things, and you probably see this all the time on cases, I really wished that the officers initially, when they had taken the report in reference to the missing person, I wish they would have taken it just a little bit more serious. If I was to armchair quarterback it to some extent, I think that they were a little dismissive that, hey, she's got a little bit of a drug history, or maybe she did, and she'll probably be back eventually. And there was a lot of things that I wish that they had done back then. But the problem that I came across was, first of all, I was fascinated with the case anyway. So when the main detective, which was a guy that had been in homicide for a long time, he retired, I took that case. I just grabbed it and stuck it up on my shelf. But I couldn't tell you how many prosecutors I had talked to. I had talked to prosecutors from several different jurisdictions, because we had heard that she went from here, she went over to this other jurisdiction, and then I started hearing rumors that maybe she was buried somewhere. We didn't know where. And then ultimately I got rumors, or there was stuff that was told to me that she was buried in New Mexico. So then, of course, the New Mexico State Police told me flat out, they said, "You're wasting your time even thinking about doing that type of a case here." Maybe that's changed a little bit, but
I hope so.
But the one thing that I did want to mention is, and I think my case, and you may even know it since you've researched a little bit here about this, I think mine might have been the only one in Tulsa City, the city of Tulsa history. Mm-hmm. I know that there may have been one or two that has happened in the county. Actually, one of them right after mine, believe it or not, it was somebody probably got dismembered and put in a dumpster and shipped off to lands unknown, maybe China, on a barge. We don't know, but there was enough blood to where they were actually able to say, but it was another jurisdiction. But I think mine might have been, at least according to your first book, maybe the 14th in state history. So that's how rare. That's how. I mean, do you have any idea? Or I'm sure I'm kind of throwing you one that you may not know exactly.
Well, I can check my book right here, Jason, that Oklahoma, according to the state index, let's see, has only had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 cases total. And that doesn't count. There may be some co-defendant cases in there. And you all actually, and when I was going back looking at my emails of our conversation earlier, I noted that you have a prosecutor out there named, or you had, I don't think he's still an active prosecutor, a guy named Chris Ross, who is one of the few prosecutors who has prosecuted multiple, and he was out of Ada County, I believe.
Yep. And I think you passed me along to him, and I did talk to him, and he was incredibly helpful as well.
Yeah, great guy. I actually met him at a conference, and we've communicated over the years. He has prosecuted 4 or 5 no-body murder cases, which is, virtually unheard of. I think 5 is the most anybody's ever prosecuted. Wow. But yeah, so there's not, it's funny. I call some states kind of punch above their weight and have more. And definitely Oklahoma is one that, based on population, has kind of more that have been successfully prosecuted. And you mentioned New Mexico. There are some states that are very reluctant to do it, which is I'll say upsetting to me, because to me, as a prosecutor, you're not looking to win cases. That's not what the job is. The job is to do justice. And look, I've lost homicide cases. I tried 20 homicide cases. I don't know, I lost 4 or 5, something like that. But that's what you have to do. You have to not be afraid to lose some cases, because these no-body cases are really hard to get to trial. When you get it to trial, it tends to be successful. The hard part is getting it there. Yeah. And unfortunately, there are still a lot of prosecutors who don't want to take them to trial. And to me, that's very disappointing. Then you have people like Chris Ross who are like, hell yeah, I'll take it. I'll do it. And that's really what you need to do. And obviously you have to weigh, will I find the body? If the case is a year old, I typically tell prosecutors, keep looking for the body. I mean, I've spent the last 17, 18 years preaching the gospel of trying no body cases. But I tell everyone, if you can find a body, that's way better. That's what you want. But I also know in Oklahoma, if you tell me you're 5, 6, 7 years out, are you going to find a body? Nah, you're probably not, given the climate there. It's highly unlikely. If you're in Florida, I'm going to tell you 3, 4, 5 years. No. If you're in Minnesota, I'm going to tell you maybe 8, 9, 10. But at some point, you have to say the evidence is not going to get any better, and I got to take my shot.
Yeah.
What were some of the things? Go ahead, Jason.
Well, I was going to just say briefly, one of the things that I want to at least mention is, I think that for those of you that are listening to this, and especially if you're law enforcement and you happen to have one of these type of cases, I hope that you're listening to this. But one of the things that I would at least I would suggest is making sure that the family is on board with the fact that if we were to go to trial on something like this, that you're prepared for the fact that you could lose, and
yes,
and to prepare them for that, as opposed to them just being shell shocked with, oh, we went to trial on it because we just thought that this was the best road. And I think that it's imperative to have the family on board with going that route. And mine was, I asked him, I said, hey, do you realize that we could lose this case? But I'll tell you right now, this case is never going to get any better. Yes. And they were absolutely on board one way or the other. And we went forward. And I have to give a shout out to Kenny Elmore, he was an assistant. He's now a U.S. attorney as well. He was an assistant. Now he's an assistant U.S. attorney. But he had the courage to take this case on. Yes, that's what I was looking for. He had the balls to do this, and he did a tremendous job. And
I think that's a really good point, Jason. And I did that in all of my homicide cases, because trying cases in D.C. is a very fraught thing, where you have a lot of people in D.C. who do not feel the police, for lack of a better term. And that can be people who are in the African-American community, and that can be people who are very white and liberal in certain communities, neither of which necessarily believe the police. So I was always very careful to tell my families, it's a little bit of a crapshoot when you go to trial. A plea is always better, because you have some certainty, even if it's pleading to something less, second-degree murder or manslaughter. But you do have to tell every family. You just can't predict. One of the strongest cases I ever had ended up in an acquittal. And I was shocked. I had a 12-year-old boy looking out the window at the murder, and he knew the murderer. And the jury acquitted. And I was honest because there was no reason for this 12-year-old to lie. But then the no body murder case that I had, despite it being a no body, was a very strong case. We had a confession to the police, we had a confession to friends and family, and we had DNA evidence. So we had kind of what you see in a typical no body murder case are those three elements. We had all three of them. And of course, in that case, we got a conviction, or I wouldn't be doing any of this if I'd actually lost the case, because I've been a freaking loser.
Go ahead, Ronnie, because you had a question.
Other than the obvious, there's no body, what are some of the common threads you saw defense attorneys trying to attack the case, or did they just really focus on, hey, you guys don't have a body?
I think for the most part, they foolishly focus on not having a body. And I think what that ended up doing for prosecutors is it enables prosecutors to spend a lot of time proving that the person is not missing, that they're deceased. And in order to do that, as a prosecutor, you spend a lot of time building up your victim and painting a portrait of your victim. In my case, my victim had 5 children, 4 of whom testified, and she had a lot of siblings, 3 of whom testified. So the jury gets this picture of the person that for the most part is very positive. And in my case, she was no longer a drug abuser, but she was an alcohol abuser. She was living in Section 8 housing, public housing. She was a welfare mother in terms of getting welfare. So in a lot of ways, sort of negatively portrayed if you just went by the stereotype of what these people are. But when you painted the picture of her, she was a very good mother. She was very close with her children. Even though she'd had the children with 3 different men, all of those men were very involved in their children's lives. And we got to paint that portrait. And what ends up happening is the jury, I think, subconsciously looks at that and is kind of like, she seems like a nice lady, and this son of a bitch is the one who killed her. That's not good.
Yeah.
And the only reason I got to do so much of that, or any prosecutor gets to do that, is because the defense is saying, well, we don't even know if she's dead. If a smart defense counsel could probably say, oh, we concede she's dead, but we don't think that this guy did it, that my client did it. That may lessen some of that. But I'll tell you, Ronnie, most defense counsel can't help themselves because they just believe, hey, if we don't have a body, we're going to be able to prove to the jury that they can't even prove that she's actually not missing, but actually dead. And they just can't help themselves from doing that.
And a little follow up to that real quick, Jason, if you don't mind. Have you had a chance to talk to jurors and like get a feel of the ones who did do the convictions, or even some that, did an acquittal, and get a kind of a mindset from the jurors' perspective?
Yes. So in my case, I did talk to some of the jurors afterwards, and they just basically felt like the evidence was overwhelming, even though it was all circumstantial. We had no direct evidence. They felt like it was just so overwhelming because, like I said, we had DNA. We had a confession to police that was on video, which helped. We had confession to friends and family. He had told people a slightly different story, but a plausible story for what we actually thought happened. And in talking to other prosecutors who have spoken to juries, I think the cases that I've seen, and certainly the handful I've worked on or consulted on where there have been acquittals, they've just been really weak cases. I mean, I can kind of tell you, without knowing what your jury pool is like, I can kind of tell you, I think that case is going to be a guilty and that case is not going to be a guilty. I think over the years, I'm pretty good at looking at a case and saying, you need something else. You don't quite have it here. And that doesn't take into account, a jury pool, because a jury pool in Orange County, California, which is pretty conservative, is very different from a jury pool in Newark, New Jersey, or Washington, D.C., where there's a lot of skepticism. I get the sense that jurors in Oklahoma are pretty good. They're pretty conservative, and it's a generally more favorable one. And I don't take that into account. I simply say This is what I see objectively. You've got to tell me what you feel like your jury is going to accept and going to not accept. Are they going to believe maybe a confession to police that's not recorded, although that's becoming increasingly rarer? Are they going to believe a cooperator or a snitch? Is your jury pool tend to agree with those folks or no? Is DNA going to be a problem? There's a ton of jurisdictions, obviously, where people accept it. There's not to say there aren't any issues with DNA, but the science behind DNA is 100% solid. It's only whether they did it right and they followed protocol in the chain of custody. But there shouldn't be anybody who says, oh, I don't believe in DNA. But we know we have jurors who feel that way, right? Oh, I'm never going to believe DNA. So those to me are really the challenges of, I can give you a pretty good risk assessment of objectively where this case falls, but you've got to fill in what your jury believes in your jurisdiction.
Now, I'm sure you get requests from time to time from various people throughout the country, probably more so from detectives than prosecutors, where they're like,
yes,
can you look at this case? And
yes.
Number one, do you do that? Is that something that
yes.
you do?
Yep, I absolutely do. What I say to detectives, and you're right, it's more detectives than prosecutors, although just today I got an email from a prosecutor who sent me a whole bunch of information and said, can you help me get set up for trial in a couple of months, which I'm happy to do. But generally it's from detectives. And what I say to them is, send me the entire file. I need everything. If you got to send, I got a hard drive right here. I don't know how big it is, but I got this for a case. Send me this entire file. I want everything. I want all the crime scene photos. I want all the interviews. I don't care how big it is. Send it to me. I will look at everything. I will go through everything. I'll give you a report, and then you and I, or you and the prosecutors and I, will sit down and go over it. And what I do is, I don't do any work myself. I don't go out and, I'm not banging on doors in Ada, Oklahoma. I'm telling folks, this is what you all need to do. Here's my to-do list. This is what I think you need. This is my sort of evaluation of the case, of what I think it needs, whether I think it's a good case, a bad case. I remember one time I looked at a case a couple of years ago that was so strong. I said, if your DA doesn't take this case, I'm moving to your jurisdiction. I'm going to get sworn in as an ADA. I'm going to try this goddamn case. Like, it is so strong. This is ridiculous that they're not taking it. Most cases aren't like that. Most of the ones I look at usually need a little bit of help, a little push across the finish line. And I happily do that. And the best thing about it is it's all free, because I cannot charge for any of my services, which is fine, because for the most part, I think police departments aren't going to pay for it. So you kind of get what you pay for, but it is actually free.
Yeah, and I think that's amazing that you're able to do that for free, because if you're a law enforcement agency, if you're listening to this, or if you know of somebody that has a no body case, I think they're foolish not to at least consider calling you or messaging you. And you're probably sitting there going, well, wait a second.
No, I really,
you're welcome.
I'm getting close to retirement. And I've often said, people say, what are you doing when you retire? And I say, well, I probably do a little bit more full time on this. It's kind of more than a hobby, less than a job, because I have a regular day job. But it is something I am very passionate about. I lately have worked on a few missing and murdered Indigenous women, which I know is not uncommon in Oklahoma. And that's something I've become very passionate about, because I think it is an incredibly underrepresented and underinvestigated number of cases in reservations in Indian country, which Oklahoma obviously has. And that's something my eyes were kind of open to over the last few years. And I have a case that I've worked on in Montana for a number of years. And I think you start to learn there are these areas of cases that are vastly underinvestigated and aren't treated the same way. I mean, we all know this, right? The white, pretty blonde girls get a ton of attention, and the other cases don't don't necessarily. My victim in my case, as I said, was a African-American female with 5 kids from 3 fathers. She was an alcoholic in Section 8 housing. There could have very easily have been the idea of, we're not going to look into this case and we're not going to investigate it. And one of the things that irritated me about my own case for many years is I felt like it had so many interesting features to it, and I wrote about it in my latest edition. They asked me to do an entire chapter on it. There were so many fascinating features to it, and it just had never been covered really to a great extent in the media, other than, you know, the Washington Post, my local paper. But in the last few years, there's been a TV show on it and a bunch of podcasts on it, which was really gratifying to me, because I felt like this is a story that needs to be told, and it's not one that is typically told.
We had one of the viewers ask, have you done anything in Canada and I'll add any other countries, or has it all been in the U.S.?
So I mostly focus in the U.S., but I have worked on a case in Canada. I've consulted with some Canadian folks. I've also worked with some people in England, and also Norway, I believe, was the other country. Okay. And I'm open to that. You know, on my website, I decided early on I was just going to track United States cases. There was a guy in Australia who was tracking no-body murder cases nationwide. I'm sorry, globally, believe it or not.
Yeah.
I've kind of lost touch with him over the years. But he was someone who was really doing cases all over the place, and I decided to just do the U.S. But it doesn't mean I won't consult with anyone in other countries at all. And I actually know someone in Canada who's written a book on a no-body murder case there. And he and I have corresponded. So, you know, and the Canadian system obviously is very close to ours and very close to England. I think a lot of our evidentiary rules and the way we present things translate very easily to those countries.
So, you know, you said earlier that, like, let's just take Oklahoma as an example, you know, where you say we've had 17 cases that you know of that have been no body cases. What is your advice to detectives that are sitting there, and what would you recommend, or what is some of the common issues that you see where, like, mistakes made by a detective? That's kind of a compound question, but
no, I think it's a fair question. I mean, I would say the first thing I would say, and this is not to plug my book, I don't make that much money off it. I know it's an expensive book, but I would say, number one, get the book, because it does give you some commonalities that you find in no-body murder cases, and I'll name some of them here. One of the things you find is evidence of cleaning up. So when you're going into a crime scene, you need to be looking for what is present and what is missing, right? Is there a set of knives that are there and the big one is missing? You talk to the neighbor and you say, well, he had a chainsaw, and now he doesn't have the chainsaw. When you're working with your crime scene techs, are they pulling out the drains? Are they pulling out the drains from the sink? Are they pulling out the drains from the bathroom? It is absolutely critical to do those types of things. The second thing is, in addition to the evidence of cleaning up, is look for the defendant's lies. That is one thing I think we in law enforcement overlook all the time. And I tell this story that I have 2 daughters who are 26 and 24 now. And when they were younger, I came home one day and they said, Daddy, what did you do today? I said, well, girls, I sat at my desk and I had people lie to me all day, because we all know that, right? You guys bring in witnesses to us as prosecutors, we subpoena people in, and they all lie to us all day. So we get inured to that. It is not a big deal. We're used to working our way through that. But when you tell juries, hey, when we first brought this guy in, he said he was X place, we found out he was Y place. He said that he did X and Y and Z with his wife, but we're able to prove he didn't do that thing. That is a big thing to a jury, when you can say to them, why would Tad lie about this if he had nothing to do with his wife's disappearance? Because those of us who are married or in relationships, if our significant other went missing, we'd do anything to find them if we had nothing to do with it. But if we had something to do with it, we would start lying, and we would tell these things that we as detectives later proved not to be true. And I think in law enforcement, we overlook those. And one of the things I do when I do these reports for folks that I consult on, I have a separate section, defendants' lies. And if I can list 4 or 5 of them, and I say, if you can point these out to the jury and get these in, these are super, super powerful. And these are the types of things that you look at in a no body murder case. And when you're looking for a body, I always tell folks, look for where the defendant knows. The defendant is not going to get rid of the body in a place unfamiliar to him, because the worst thing that can happen is I'm trying to get rid of a body in the middle of the night on some strange land, and I'm digging a big ass grave, and all of a sudden Farmer Joe shows up with a shotgun and says, "Hey boy, what are you doing on my property?" Well, I'm screwed at that point. So they're going to go to hunting grounds they're familiar with, woods they're used to hiking through, their grandmother's abandoned farm. So those are the types of things I think that are unique to no body murder cases that you need to think about in no body murder cases that are not intuitive to a regular homicide case. And I imagine, Tulsa's a big city like DC. A lot of your murders are, drug related or in the crime world. And that's not necessarily the case for no body murder cases, where, as I said earlier, 50+% are somehow domestically related.
Yeah. And we're talking about, especially with Jason's case, where she went missing from here, maybe the murder happens here, she gets dumped out in New Mexico. Have you found it that U.S. attorney's offices take more of the cases than like state DAs, a county, just because of the larger jurisdiction area, or is it just kind of depends on what's up?
Yeah, good question. In fact, I'd say sadly the opposite. There are not many federal murder cases because when you have a missing person, it's really hard. One of the best challenges, and I hope there's no defense attorneys on here listening. If there are, turn your earphones off. But one of the best challenges is a venue challenge, right? You say, we don't know where this happened. How do you know this happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma? It could have happened in 2 counties over, which is a different DA. It could have happened in in Texas, not in Oklahoma. And that is a real challenge. I would say over the last few years, I've probably had 5 cases where I said, I don't know. You've got a decent case, but I don't know where that case is. Is that case in Florida? Is that case in Georgia? Because I've looked at cases where people have traveled from one place to another. They're in Florida, they travel to Georgia to see their ex-spouse or they see their boyfriend. Well, all of a sudden you're saying, where did this happen? Now, in those cases, the U.S. Attorney's Office is the right person to take it, because then you've got interstate kidnapping or something like that. But in being a former, assistant U.S. attorney, I've spent some time arguing with people saying, you really got to take this case. But I have found the vast majority of cases are handled by the state prosecutors.
And I got to add to that a little bit, because mine was the same kind of issues.
Right.
And in my case, actually, it made some case law. But one of the things that the DA, and I thought he was brilliant with this, is one of the words that was in the statute, and I'm not a lawyer, so I just remember him telling me this, is he said, and he really hammered this home in all of their arguments, and that was the word inveigle.
Yes.
Have you heard it?
It's I love that word. I try to use it in conversation every day, inveigle. But it basically means improperly lured someone. And it's so funny you say that, Jason, because the case I was talking about in Georgia and Florida, we had the same thing. We were going over the word inveigled in the statute. It's such a weird, it's like should be on Jeopardy or something. But that's a big part of it. If you can prove they improperly lured them to the other jurisdiction, then you got a case.
And so what the description was that he gave, and essentially the way he described it was that she was kidnapped. He actually picked her up from where she was working on a house. But the way he put it is, she was kidnapped, but she just didn't know it.
Yes.
And so therefore the crime,
way of saying it. Yep.
The crime started there, went on to another county, From there, went back to Tulsa where he drugged her. From there, technically speaking, it's a rape in Amarillo, Texas, where this thing is just continuing on. And I say rape because they're handcuffed together. So that's rape as far as most people would consider that. And then to murdering her in New Mexico, which, by the way, she's never been found. But I just thought that was brilliant. And that was one of the things that they used in the Court of Criminal Appeals. They did. I don't know what the case law is. I don't know what the statute is, but I'll try to get it to you. But it was case law on that. And I was so happy about that. It was really exciting.
Yeah. And it's great because it's like you said, it's not kidnapping in the traditional sense of, I grab you, I put a gag on you and drag you away. It's I have tricked you into believing X, which is not true. I've lured you there and now you're there, which is an interesting part of the law, not something most people think of for sure.
Right.
Have you noticed? Sorry, I was going to say, how many have you had where after someone got convicted, they've said, "Hey, okay, you got me. Here's where the body's at." Have you ever had any of that where bodies have been found?
So I've had a handful of cases that I worked on, including the very first case I ever worked on, which took place out in Colorado. That person eventually led them to the body. And I'm aware of a number of those cases in my research. And I'm of very mixed emotions about that because on the one hand, I do think it's good. It gives some closure to the family. The family knows, hey, this happened. On the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these cases are domestic, and you both know this from your years in law enforcement. Your domestic abuser is your classic control freak. That's what a domestic abuser is. And I say he because that's generally who it is. He is all about control. He wants to control this woman and have her do what he wants her to do. And when a defendant is given the opportunity to say, okay, I'll tell you where the body is, it's always to get something for himself, right? It's take death penalty off the table, take life without parole off the table, all of those things. And then to me, it's disgusting because it is using the body as a bargaining chip. And that's highly offensive to me. But at the end of the day, I do think prosecutors have an obligation to say, we are going to take this plea or we are going to make this bargain with the devil for that. And I get that. And I'm in favor of that. But it always kind of sticks in my craw of what a crappy thing to do for the defendant.
Yeah. Listen, we've got about a minute left here. Any final thoughts that you want to throw out there?
I would just say, I tell detectives all the time, a no-body murder case is the hardest case you're ever going to do. You have to never give up hope and you have to keep trying. I've worked on, 40 of these cases. Probably half of them have gone to trial. The other half we're going to see someday, but you just can't quit. And that is a trait in homicide detectives that you have to have. No quit.
Yeah, agreed. Listen, I cannot thank you enough, Tad. I feel fortunate to have you. I consider you a friend, even though you're like, I don't really know this guy, but you're a friend of mine. And I'm glad to have you in my stable of experts that really are there for us, that can help us. Get his book. If you are a cop and you have a case or a detective, please put it up there. Get that book. I love it. I really do. That's the older version, but get the newer one.
Yeah, that's the older version. Get the new one. It's a little pricier, but thank you both for having me on. I'm a big fan of the first 48. I don't know if you read in the book, I tell a funny story about the first 48.
Well, I appreciate you being
I will let you read into that.
I will. And Paul Keith, the guy that organizes for the homicide investigators of Texas, he's been sitting in here because I told him to be here, meet Tad, see Tad. And so I think I'm going to try to go to that. And if they get you there, I'm going to try to be there. So I'll meet you in person.
Great. And that's free too.
No, absolutely.
I get my expenses, but you don't have a fee or anything. It's all gratis.
Listen, I can't Ronnie, you got anything else? Because we got to get off of here.
Thank you for being on there. I actually have an old case that's popped in my head that I may reach out to you on.
Great.
Absolutely. Love to talk to you, Ronnie.
Love it, Tad. Thanks a lot, man. This is one of my favorite episodes, actually. You're just incredible. I really think the world of you. Ladies and gentlemen, that's been it for tonight. We're gonna go ahead and close out with the music so Amanda can move on to the next show. Wiretap. Thanks a lot, everybody, for being here. Tell your friends and family to watch and to listen. Take care. See you, everybody. Bye.
See you guys.